It's an exhibition that brings some of the great nudes from the Tate's collection, so works by Bonnard, Matisse, Picasso, and also work by contemporary artists like Cindy Sherman and John Copland. So a really wonderful overview of work in the collection on this subject, and many of the works have never travelled to New Zealand before, so it's the first opportunity to see them, including of course Rodin's The Kiss, which is the star piece in the show. The concept of the body laid bare is a look at the nude through history, investigating how artists have approached the subject differently in response to different historical and political moments. It ranges right through from the historical nudes of the Victorian period to contemporary artists who use their own bodies to investigate the vulnerability of the human body. The work in the exhibition that fascinates me is actually one of the most modest works by a woman artist, Gwen John. It's a depiction of the model Fenella Lovell, and there's really interesting accounts by Gwen John of how much she hated the model she was painting. So I would love to know a little bit more about that relationship, and you can see the tension in the model's pose, that this isn't a sort of happy relationship between the artist and the person she's painting. The difference between nude and naked was really established in the 1950s by Kenneth Clark, who wrote the classic study, The Nude, who defined the nude as an approach to the body which was about idealisation and form. It was challenged by the critic John Berger in the 1970s, who thought that this was a very artificial way of approaching the body, and thought that the naked, which was about just the body laid bare, as the title of this exhibition shows, was a much more natural and more honest way to depict real people rather than idealised bodies. I think because it's a subject that everyone can identify with. We all have a body, so we see artist depictions of them as reflections of ourselves, and we're able to see how ideas about the body have changed over time by looking at the nudes in the exhibition. The show depicts a number of relationships between artists and models, and it's really fascinating to delve deeper into those questions in particular works. For instance, Picasso's portrait of Marie-Thérèse Walter is a wonderful example of how passion can be transformed into a sensual, curving form, which is what the painting is composed of formally. But we also have more awkward relationships, like the relationship between Gwen John and the model Fenella Lovell, who she intensely disliked, and the tension of that pose really brings that tension between the artist and the model to life. The Kiss depicts the lovers Paolo and Francesca from Dante's Inferno, and it shows the exact moment when they realise their passion for each other and draw together in this passionate embrace. So they're always in this moment of anticipation, permanently encapsulated in marble. So many of the works in the exhibition were controversial in their time, even works that now seem very idealised to us. A particular example is Philip Wilson Steers' Nude with a Hat, which was considered indecent because the nude was clothed. So often it's about the nude being not a natural state, but a state of undress, of taking off clothes, that causes the problem. The exhibition traces the way that the nude has changed in response to society, and it's particularly obvious in the change between the way that men are looking at women and then the critique of that in the 1970s, which is a period when feminist artists first started producing works which looked at those representations by male artists. So key figures like the Gorilla Girls, for instance, look at the way that the museum collections are full of female nudes but not full of women artists. So those ideas really come into play in the later 20th century, but there are shifts throughout the period of the exhibition that you can follow in these portrayals. Well, we've got two nudes wearing hats in the exhibition, Philip Wilson Steers nude with a hat, and also the Alice Neal portrait of Kitty Pearson in the 1970s room. In both cases, I think it's fine for a nude to wear a hat, but the problem for contemporary viewers of the steer, at least, was the idea that the nude had taken off her clothes rather than being in a state of natural undress. So it brings this slightly sensuous, erotic dimension to the nude that was problematic at the time. So when you first look at the Picasso work, what you see is this wonderful, voluptuous, sensuous figure composed entirely of sweeping curves. So that's the immediate impression, but if you look closely at the face of the figure, you can see there's actually a double face there, the sitter both in full face and in profile. So it looks as if a kiss is taking place within the face of the nude, which really encapsulates this passionate relationship of Picasso to his model, which is portrayed in this painting. Matisse's draped nude is a kind of nude called an odalisque, so it was derived from the idea of the Turkish harem, and this is both about a very voluptuous passive pose for the nude that you see both in Matisse but earlier in work by Ingres, for instance. But Matisse also loved the visual culture of Morocco and collected hangings and different artefacts which he composed in his studio to provide a background for these nudes. So for instance, the pattern fabric and the pot plant are intended to evoke that idea of the odalisque. The exhibition shows how the nude has shifted through time, and the future for the nude in art will surely bring other changes. One of the major tendencies in the latter part of the show is for artists to evoke the vulnerability of the body through large format photography, and that seems to be a key theme that will develop in the future. But also the artist's use of their own body as model is one of those key ideas that comes into the exhibition in the later 20th century. So I think those tendencies will probably continue into the future, but who knows? I mean, it could go in lots of other directions. The most obvious difference between a sculpted nude and a painted nude is that you can walk around a sculpted nude and see it from any direction. So it's there as a physical object in the space with you rather than an image. But there are also examples of work in the show, particularly in the modern room, where you see painters trying to evoke that. For instance, Picasso's Cubist nude, where the faceting of the figure is to evoke looking at it from different viewpoints. I would say the 1970s, which is when you have feminist perspectives on the nude really changing the way we think about the subject, particularly the way that female artists critiqued male visions of the female nude. So we have works in that section of the show that show a really nice reversal in terms of women artists depicting male nudes in similarly passive poses, which makes us realise how these aren't a natural way to look at all, but they're very constructed aesthetically and socially. I think my favourite section is the 1970s section because it is such a key moment for starting to look at different ways of portraying the nude and introducing a range of perspectives. And it's when work by women artists is at its most fertile and most creative in terms of the different approaches that they take to the subject and the way that they affect the way that male artists depict the nude from that moment onwards. I've been asked before what I think the most provocative body part in the nude is, and it's not the obvious ones, but I think it's actually the mouth, because it is something that has both a physical presence but also is the way of communicating ideas, and very radical ideas at that. So some of the works in the show are about text as well as images, and that's one way in which you see that ideas about the nude don't have to be visual at all. They can be conveyed through narrative, such as the Fiona Banner spilt nude in the exhibition. Most of the nudes in the show seem very happy to be naked. So it's actually works where there's a real discomfort in the relationship between artist and sitter, where you think that perhaps these are less happy as nudes than other works in the show. One of the key examples of that is Stanley Spencer's portrait of the artist with his second wife, Patricia Priest, which has this incredible air of sexual tension, which reflects the relationship between the two, the painter and his wife, depicted in that work.